Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 23rd of January of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to continue with the ultimatum that was issued by the 47th President of the United States of America, Donald Trump. I'll remind you that this morning he published a very interesting article in his social networks, and according to this article, according to this ultimatum, when summarizing everything, he offered the Russia to surrender. He offered Putin, the Russians to surrender without showing any resistance. Of course, just on the paper, but anyway, he demanded, maybe not even suggested. Otherwise, if Putin doesn't accept this deal, doesn't accept this ultimatum, then most likely Donald Trump will put high levels of taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States and various other participating countries. So that these words are very strong, obviously, we can say this. And during the previous 24 hours, at least I was waiting the reaction of the Russian officials on this statement and what the Russians are going to do next, whether they're going to accept this deal, accept this ultimatum, or they will reject this. And you know, when we were talking about this ultimatum in the previous video, I told you that most likely the Russians would not even read this ultimatum by the end, till the last line, because during this ultimatum, Donald Trump not just suggested the Russians to surrender, but he also insulted the Russians' feelings. I'll try to explain to you. I'll remind you that according to Russians' understanding and the United States understanding and the West understanding of the Second World War, we see that there is a very huge gap. For example, Trump stated that we must never forget that Russia helped us, the United States of America, win the Second World War, losing almost 60 million lives in the process. So according to Donald Trump, the United States of America and the Western countries were fighting with Germany in the Second World War, and Russia was just helping the Western countries to win Germany. So this is the thing that insulted and most likely would insult the Russians very much. And when we were discussing the situation, it was very interesting to see the Russian reaction. And right after we published the video, right after Trump published his ultimatum, several hours probably after, the Russians gave their own statement. So the Russians stated that Moscow does not agree with Trump's opinion that Russia helped the United States win World War II. That was stated by the press secretary of Vladimir Putin. He recalled that the USSR paid the highest price in the fight against fascism, and for America it's always business. So that was stated by the Russian officials. And as you can see, the most important thing, that the Russians didn't make any other statement regarding Trump's ultimatum. They commented just this statement, that the Second World War was won by the United States of America and their allies, and the Russians were just helping them, and the Russians made their own statement just regarding that message. The Russians didn't say anything about tariffs, about sanctions, about finishing the war using the easy way. The Russians didn't say anything about Ukraine. They just commented the situation with the Second World War, which means that only this part insulted the Russians most of all, exactly as we were talking during the previous video. So most likely, according to this statement, we can make a conclusion that most likely the Russians rejected the Trump's ultimatum, and now it's once again turn of Donald Trump, the 47th President of the United States of America, to think what's to do next. And while he's thinking, let's discuss the situation on the ground, and this time we are going to talk about probably very interesting direction. We are talking about Liman. We've been talking about this direction for a very long period of time, when the Russians basically crossed the river of Zherebets and managed to establish a control over the village of Ivanovka. And for the previous 2-3 weeks, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly. Today, the Russians improved their positions once again. For example, the map that you can see in front of your screens is the situation by the end of the 22nd of January, and by the end of the 23rd of January, the Russians managed to take under control at least 2 strongholds, and the Russians managed to outflank 3 more strongholds in the northwestern direction. So what is so important about this direction? Because according to my understanding of the things that that are happening right now, most likely the Russians are preparing themselves before another full-scale offensive operation in the direction of the town of Liman, and most likely the Russians are planning to break through the Ukrainian defense belt to defeat the Ukrainians completely and to semi-encircle the city of Siversk from the north. So why is that? Why do I think that this situation is going to happen exactly this way? During the previous 24 hours, the Russians published very interesting video that comes from the northern Slaviansk. In this video, we can see how the Russian drone was flying above the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine to the north of the city of Slaviansk. In this video, we can see how the Russians managed to discover a huge concentration of the armored forces of Ukraine. Hundreds of vehicles, maybe thousands of Ukrainian soldiers, and when the Russians managed to collect information, they began, I don't know, destroying these positions, attacking these positions with missiles, with cluster rounds. Most likely the Ukrainians suffered huge losses, significant losses. And later, different sources reported that the Ukrainians, that this is the base of the 18th Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine, and most likely the Ukrainians were planning to use this 18th Brigade with the purpose to, let's say, to counterattack or to support Ukrainian contingent in the Liman direction. As I made this conclusion based on the distance, because this is the nearest position to the area of very heavy clashes in the vicinity of Kolodezi, and this base was completely destroyed, and most likely in the short-term period the Ukrainians lost possibilities to redeploy forces in this direction. Furthermore, from the same area we got another video from the settlement of Drobyshevo. In this video we can see another base of the armored forces of Ukraine that was discovered by the Russians, and as a result of RBK 500 aviation bomb attack, the Ukrainians also suffered significant losses. So as you can see, just for the previous 24, 48, 72 hours, the Russians tried and made significant progress by destroying huge concentrations of Ukrainian forces in this area. And most likely for the next day or two, they will control the initiative, and they will have possibilities to attack with the purpose to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and to improve their positions on the Ukrainian side of the river of Zherebets. So we are waiting for the Russian attack. Most likely this is going to happen in the very near future, because the Ukrainians of course will try to restore losses, so that's why the Russians don't have lots of time. They have just several days, and then the situation will be stabilized once again. So let's wait and see whether the Russians are able to use this initiative. Furthermore, we got another important statement that was made by the Ukrainian sources. The Ukrainians are saying that the Russians managed to improve their positions in the Liman direction significantly. The Ukrainians are saying that the Russians redeployed the significant number of North Koreans artillery systems. You know that this artillery system by the name of Okaksan, this is 170 millimeters artillery shells that are very powerful, and the Ukrainians are saying that the Russians don't need to use even FABs, because these artillery systems of 170 millimeters can destroy everything, there are no strongholds that can stay and hold under the pressure of these artillery systems. They are very long range, more than 40 kilometers, and the Ukrainians are saying that the Russians began using this artillery system massively in the Liman direction. So this is another proof, another evidence that the Russians that they're decided to attack in this area and to begin the third battle for Liman, because as I understand, the Russians realized the only way to attack the city of Siversk is by encircling this city, by taking the town of Liman, Yampol, and maybe then from the area of the village or town of Liman to cross the river of Seversky Donetsk and to attack the city of Siversk from behind. As I understand, this is the only solution for the Russians, and now most likely they are going to, let's say, to complete this task. Let's wait and see, of course, what is going to be next, but once again, the dynamic and how the Russians improve their position from day to day tell us that most likely things that we just discussed is the situation on the ground. Now let's move further. And let's discuss once again from the beginning, and let's discuss with the another important area, the area of Velyka Novosilka. As you can see, we have adjusted the map in Russian favor. We have cut the town of Velyka Novosilka into, there is a northern part already and the southern part. But before we start, I would like to discuss how the entire progress, how the battle of Velyka Novosilka was developing for the previous several days. For example, the situation that you can see right now in front of your screens is the situation by the end of the 15th of January. And basically, the 15th of January is the day when the Russians began their final offensive operation in the direction of Velyka Novosilka. During that day, we got lots of videos of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine with the use of FABs. During this day, we got lots of videos of how the Russians were attacking the southern part of the settlement with the TOS flamethrower systems and different multiple launch rocket systems. So those were episodes of artillery preparation before the offensive operation began. And on the 16th of January of 2025, we got the first update that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to enter the southern part of Vremivka. So that was the first sign that the situation is difficult and that the front line collapses. On the 17th of January of 2025, we got the first video from the most northern part of the settlement of Vremivka, how 4 Russian soldiers were establishing the flag in, once again, the most northern part of Vremivka. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map, and by the end of the 17th of January, the Russians established control over more than 90% of the settlement. By the 18th of January, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported and confirmed complete control over the settlement, and by the end of the 18th of January, we have colored the village of Vremivka completely in Russian favor. So no doubts that the Russians, that they were Ukrainians. Maybe there were several pockets of resistance, but I'm not even sure about this. And when the Russians secured the village of Niskuchne, secured the village of Vremivka, furthermore, different pro-Russian sources reported that the armored forces of Russian Federation crossed the river of Mokry Yaly, and they began advancing in the central part of the city, of the town of Velyka Novosilka. But yet, by the end of the 23rd of January, we still haven't received anything that can confirm additional progress on the ground exactly in this part of the settlement. And starting on the 19th of January, the Russians began another offensive operation, but this time the Russians were attacking from the east, from the northeast, and from the north. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 19th of January. The Russians managed to enter the town of Velyka Novosilka itself. The Ukrainians, by the end of the 19th of January, lost their possibilities for evacuation, but by the end of the 19th of January, Velyka Novosilka was a single stronghold without any parts. It was one defense belt, one stronghold, and the Ukrainians were still resisting the Russian offensive. By the 20th of January and starting on the 20th of January, the Russians began improving their positions slowly, step by step, one block after another. As you can see, small advances, but the Russians were moving. And by the 22nd of January, so yesterday in the evening, we got the first report that Ukrainians were encircled completely and they lost possibilities to evacuate from the town of Velyka Novosilka. And exactly during the 22nd of January, we got first reports that Ukrainians were trying to break through the encirclement through the village of Vremivka, but the Ukrainians were discovered and destroyed. And this is the situation. But anyway, despite the fact that Velyka Novosilka was encircled completely by the 22nd of January, it was still a single stronghold. But by the end of the 23rd of January, we cut this territory in two, because lots of sources reported that the southern part was completely cut from the central part, and this is completely separate encirclement and the first cauldron of the Velyka Novosilka direction. This information was provided us by different mappers. Pro-Ukrainian sources confirmed this, neutral sources confirmed this, and the Russians not just confirmed this, but also they colored map map accordingly, showing us that the southern part was a separate stronghold, and the northern and the central part was completely different positions. According to information we have, the southern part is under the responsibilities of 110th Mechanized Brigade that was abandoned by the Ukrainian commanders. So as you can see, the situation is very difficult, and this is already the final phase because the Russians suggested the Ukrainians to surrender. So this is the map that currently the Russians are trying to spread between the Ukrainian channels. They're trying to send this information, also papers, applications to the Ukrainians, to the relatives of the 110th Brigade, to force them, to ask them to surrender. Also, the Russians said that there is just one road. If Ukrainians use this Azovska street, and if the Ukrainians begin moving in the southern direction, the Russians promise them that they will not be harmed and they will not be attacked by the Russians. So this is the evacuation road for those Ukrainians who decided to surrender. Most likely we are going to see several hundreds of Ukrainians who choose this way. Otherwise, the Ukrainians would be forced to make another attempt to break through the encirclement, but I think that the Ukrainians have no chances to complete this breaking through operation successfully. Now the Russians also are trying to attack the Ukrainians in the most northern part of Velyka Novosilka, because despite the fact that there is already a cauldron, that Ukrainians were caught completely in cauldron, there are still a lot of Ukrainians who think that they can break through the encirclement to cross the river of Mokre Yali and to enter the mainland. And during the previous 24 hours, the Russians published the video how they managed to discover another group of Ukrainian forces that crossed the river of Mokre Yali, and when the Russians discovered them, they began bombing and attacking these territories with artillery. Ukrainians most likely suffered losses, and they haven't managed to, maybe 10% of this group managed to survive, but I have some doubts about this. So now the Russians are trying to attack in the northern direction with the purpose to cut this territory completely and not to allow anyone from the central part of Velyka Novosilka to escape this disaster and this situation. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Andreevka fortified area direction. According to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the south by taking additional fields and tree lines under complete control, and the Russians managed to improve their positions in the fields to the northeast of Andreevka. The Russians continue their outflanking operation with the purpose to attack Andreevka from the west, which will allow the Russians to cut supply lines and to create another cauldron in this area. As for the Dnipro directions, the Russians continue their offensive operation, and today, according to different sources, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to take under control up to 40% of the settlement of Novoandreevka, obviously significant progress. This is another village that most likely would be captured by the Russians in the very near future. Now let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. Today, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, the armed forces of Russian Federation managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Solona. Based on this statement made by the Russian sources, official sources, we have adjusted the map in Russian favor. Basically, this territory used to be considered as a contested area, and now we have no doubts, based on the Ministry of Defense report, that the village was captured. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Konstantinovka direction. We have lots of very interesting updates. First of all, different sources reported that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, indeed managed to establish complete control over the settlement of Baranovka. The Ukrainians are saying that there are still Ukrainians there, that the clashes continue, and that it's too early to color this territory in Russian favor. The Russian sources published the video of the situation along N32 road, the main supply road between the city of Pokrovsk and the city of Konstantinovka, and as you can see, as a result of missile strike or as a result of FAB strike, the Russians destroyed the bridge, and as you can see, the bridge fell down, most likely on the positions and the stronghold of the armored forces of Ukraine. So now this fortified area was reduced to ruins, and now the Russians have all chances to begin advancing in this direction for the second time with the purpose to improve their positions and to take several villages around under complete control. Now let's discuss the situation in the Italy's direction. During the previous 24 hours, we got just one video, the very important one. In this video, we can see how the Russians were bombing the northern part of the mine with the FABs and SOS flamethrower systems. This is a very important video because this is not just a regular bombing. This is obviously the artillery preparation before final assault operation. So let's wait and see, and most likely tomorrow or the day after, the Russians will raise their flag above the territory of this mine. As for the Chasiv Yar direction, during the previous 24 hours, we got geolocations, we got videos that confirm complete control over the northern part of the city of Chasiv Yar. In this video, we can see the video was published by the 18th Brigade. By the way, this is the brigade that was attacked by the Russians in the vicinity of Slavinsk, the video that we discussed in the first part of the video. In this video, we can see the Russian edge positions that were FPV droned by the Ukrainians in this area. Based on several episodes from this video, we have adjusted the map in the northwestern part of the city of Chasiv Yar. Now we have no doubts that Ukrainians from the citadel were cut from the mainland, at least from the northern and the northwestern directions. They still have some roads in the southern area, but all these roads are under complete Russian fire control. As for the Sivers direction, we have discussed the Sivers direction. Most likely we should discuss with the situation in the Liman direction, and as for the Liman direction, we should expect another Russian offensive operation. As for the Kupinsk direction, the most important updates are coming from the area of Dvorechna on the Ukrainian side of the river Voskol. As you can see, we got a lot of icons from this area, and based on the icons and based on the statements of different sources, we have adjusted the map in Russian favor because the Russians continue improving their positions, and now the Ukrainians reported that they're afraid of the next stage of Russian offensive, because the Ukrainians expect that the Russians most likely will try to attack the city of Kupinsk from the north, and their main purpose is to take positions on the northern outskirts, and the second Russian attack is to move in the southwestern directions toward the settlement of Blagodatovka. If the Russians are able to cut this N26 road, the city of Kupinsk would be cotton cordon without any possibilities for anything. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.